So the first thing I want to start with might seem like a really basic thing to everybody here, which is the point that Islamophobia is a form of racism. And I say it's a basic thing, but every single time I do a meeting on Islamophobia, somebody will tell me that this is a live argument with their friends, with their workmates, with people around them, that there is still an attempt to deny that Islamophobia is actually a form of racism, that it's about discrimination, racism and persecution, rather than just being about a question of the right to criticise religion. I can give you a couple of examples. The former French Prime Minister, Manuel Valls, described Islamophobia as a fabrication of Iranian fundamentalists and an attack on republicanism. Not an extreme position in France, as we're going to go on to discuss. There are lots of people in France, not just on the right, but also on the left, who think that Islamophobia is not a real term or something that we should be talking about. In Britain, the writer and broadcaster Kenan Malik argued more than 10 years ago in a very influential essay at the time called The Islamophobia Myth. He wrote, and this is a direct quote, "There is a fundamental difference between race and religion. You can't choose your skin colour, you can choose your beliefs." And he goes on to argue that if it's okay to criticise other belief systems, to criticise liberalism or Marxism or conservatism, why isn't it okay to criticise religion? But obviously, racism is not just about skin colour. And one of the big mistakes that he misses here is that race isn't a real thing at all. Race has always been a construct, a social construct, based on ascribed characteristics that are ascribed to different groups who are then discriminated against. And it can take lots of different forms, and it has historically taken lots of different forms. So if you think about just the recent history of racism in Britain, it's targeted Irish people, as we've already talked about this morning. It's targeted Jewish people. It's targeted black people of African or Caribbean descent. It's targeted Asian people from all sorts of different descents. And another big target that we see, that we mentioned in the last session, is Eastern Europeans who are targeted by racism in Britain today. So we can see that racism changes, and it isn't just about the colour of somebody's skin. And it's not new that a group who are officially defined by religion should actually see that religion racialised, if you like, and should face racism. I think the nearest type of racism to Islamophobia is the question of anti-Semitism, where you saw Jewish people facing exactly this same sort of process of the racialising of a whole religious group. And for Muslims today, just like Jewish people facing anti-Semitism in the past and today, it doesn't matter how religious somebody actually is. This isn't actually about somebody's particular religious beliefs or how they practice their beliefs or how religious they are or they aren't or what their theological position is. People are ascribed to a particular racialised religion. They are seen as Jewish or they are seen as Muslim, and that is seen as a closed entity in and of itself. And in actual fact, when you look at how Islamophobia works, Islamophobia bears all of the recognisable features that we would understand from modern racism. It's full of stereotypes, isn't it? In fact, the fact that in Britain, pretty much all Asians are seen as Muslims, regardless of what their actual religion is, and all Muslims are seen as terrorists. So that you have a situation where actually lots of Sikhs and Hindus are also mistaken for Muslims, not to mention atheists and agnostics and all the rest of it. The writer Aaron Kundnani, who has written this fantastic book, Muslims Are Coming, a book that I highly recommend to anybody who wants to read more about how Islamophobia works in the modern age, talks about how in America, actually a lot of the common depictions of Muslims in cartoons is wearing a turban, something that's actually associated with the Sikh religion. So a complete distortion, but this is the caricature that's created. Muslims also face institutionalised discrimination and disadvantage. Disadvantage in employment, in every stage of the criminal justice system, in education. Some of this obviously is because of the way in which Islamophobia overlaps with the ethnicity of people who are already facing discrimination because they're from Asian or African backgrounds. But it's also been the case that every study that has looked into employment prospects and naming and people's names when they apply for jobs has shown that if you have what is seen to be an overtly Muslim name, you're less likely to get a job than an equivalent person applying for that job. It's also true, as I said earlier, that Muslims face racist violence. every time there is a terror attack, we see a recorded increase in racist attacks against Muslims, as Muslims are collectively punished for what is seen as wrongly seen as a Muslim problem. Muslims face suspicion and blame and have been constructed as an alien community who don't integrate. I'm going to say a bit more about this in a minute, but in much the same way that Jews in the first decades of the last century were constructed as an alien community within much of the West. And like all other forms of racism in the modern world, Islamophobia comes from the top of society. It comes from the state. We only have to look at some of the policies, such as the Prevent policy, which permeates through the whole of the state, the media, through politicians. It absolutely comes from the top of society. And one of the interesting things, I think, about Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism, whatever you want to call it, is that it combines some of the oldest forms of racism with some of the newer forms of kind of cultural racism, if you like. If you think about after the Holocaust, when ideas of biological racism were discredited, although they always make a comeback, and we can talk about that a little bit more in a minute, there was a change really to the language of racism that stopped talking about biological racism and started talking about culture and people with a different culture and people not wanting to integrate. This is not new, by the way. If you think about Margaret Thatcher back in 1978 was actually talking about how Britain faced being swamped by those of a different culture. So this argument has been going on for a little while. Islamophobia in Britain and across Europe predates, and in America, predates the war on terror. In fact, it came from a lot of these arguments about culture and integration. But the current phase of Islamophobia that we face today, I want to argue, is absolutely hinges on the question of terrorism. It's been boosted and transformed by the war on terror. And I think this question of linking Muslim communities to terrorism is absolutely at the centre of defining Islamophobia today. And there are three real ways, I think, that Islamophobia works today in terms of an argument, and they're all interrelated. So I'm just going to quickly sketch out each of them, and if people want to draw out some of these themes a bit more, that would be brilliant in the discussion. The first one, as I say, is the question of terrorism, because the question of radicalisation and how people become radicalised and why it is that some people carry out these extreme attacks of terrorism has been something that's been poured over in the press and by media pundits and all over the place. And generally from the government, from policymakers and from the press, it is seen that there is somehow something inherent in Islam that encourages terrorism. So Muslims have been constructed as a complicit community. You think about all the things that David Cameron was saying about Muslims are quietly condoning terrorism and all the disgusting things that he said to attack Muslims as a whole. So Muslims are collectively seen as responsible for any act by a Muslim in a way that nobody else would be, in the way that no Christian is held collectively responsible. Well, for example, for the acts of Tony Blair, a self-professed Christian who killed millions of people, and many people are still suffering in the Middle East through the acts of Tony Blair. But we don't say that this is a Christian issue and that we demand that all Christians should have to apologise for this. The same with other cases of individual terrorism by less high-profile and less powerful people. There is no collective responsibility unless it happens to be something that is committed by a Muslim. We also see the total decontextualisation of terrorism. So any of the real reasons why violence may be created around the world through war, through racism, that there may be a blowback effect from some of those things in terms of race, in terms of terror attacks, none of that is ever discussed. It's all pinned on there is something inherently wrong with Muslims. But we know a lot of these things, and I don't really probably need to tell people this in any great detail. The second argument, really, I think, that Islamophobia puts forward is around the question of integration. And this is linked to the question of terrorism because it's all about creating this picture of an insular and isolated community that is harbouring terrorists. And so we see repeated arguments that Muslims aren't or don't want to integrate or embrace what are called British values. Now, we know that this is a nonsense. Every single survey that's been carried out looking at social attitudes shows that actually there is an astonishingly high identification with being British among British Muslims. I find it astonishing that British Muslims still say that they feel British, given how hostile a lot of the press and the politicians are towards Muslims. But it is the case, actually, that when you look at the breakdown of the different ways in which Muslims identify themselves, there is a very strong identity as being British among most Muslims in this country, in Britain. We also know that the real barriers to integration are racism and austerity, and that actually the policies that the government are implementing are actually much more likely to drive people into more isolation and more defensive and isolated communities. But also, it's the case that we know that this idea of British values is an absolutely ridiculous, yet a very popular concept. It's absolutely central to the government's Prevent strategy. It's also, I don't know if you remember last year, Louise Casey, a character who just keeps popping up with the most terrible reports and terrible plans and strategies. She was the homelessness czar at one point, wasn't she? Now I think she's the integration czar. But she did a report last year basically arguing that Muslims aren't doing enough to integrate, and particularly targeting Muslim women. Surprise, surprise, yet again. Muslim women are at the brunt of this, and saying that Muslim women are too isolated and don't learn enough English, and also arguing that people should be asked to swear an integration oath, which I don't know what that means, but anyway, there you go. That will solve the problems, apparently. But the idea of British values, obviously, there are so many things wrong with this. The idea that all British people are the same and have the same values, the idea that we have the same values as Theresa May is an absolute nonsense, or Tony Blair, having mentioned one of our favourite old villains, or a whole number of other people. Our society is absolutely riven by class, by division, by racism, by austerity. We are not all in it together. And the idea that there is one set of British values that we all adhere to is a nonsense. The idea that the British state adheres to any of the so-called British values of freedom, democracy, fairness, justice is an absolute joke. And there's also something quite racist about saying that these are British values, that nobody from any other part of the world could ever have thought that freedom or justice were a good idea. This is only a British thing, apparently. So these are completely ridiculous ideas, and yet these are ideas that are used once again to beat Muslims with, and it's an absolute insult. But the question of integration is also at the centre of what Le Pen has done in France, is that her argument is that Muslims from North African descent can't integrate into French society and are therefore part of some sort of enemy within the French state. So this is an argument that goes beyond Britain to the rest of society. And linked to the question of integration is really what I think is the third argument, which is around the question of demographics. The idea and the fear that's whipped up, the title of Aaron Kundani's book, The Muslims Are Coming, the idea that Muslims are somehow taking over. And this is linked, I think, to quite nasty biological ideas of breeding. Because it's the idea that Muslims are now breeding so that they can take over society. And so every so often we have the scare stories about this. You know, you will remember that there's a number of no-goes areas for non-Muslims in Britain, including the whole of Birmingham, you'll remember. So, yeah, anyway. But this happens every so often, that there is a scare story about, you know, this part of Europe is going to be taken over by Muslims, Muslims are breeding too fast, or certain wards or certain constituencies in Britain are going to have more and more Muslims. In actual fact, if you look at the figures, actually Muslims only make up 4% of Europe's population, and there is no country in Europe where Muslims make up more than 7% of that country. So all of these scare stories obviously bear no resemblance to reality. They're all based on whipping up racism, and they're based on absolute myths. And if it is true that Muslims are concentrated, as it is in some areas of Britain, that is because of poverty. Because actually, thank you. Actually, nearly half of England's Muslim population actually lives in the 10 most deprived local authority areas in Britain. So if there is a lack of integration. That is because of the systematic discrimination that Muslims face that is pushing them into poverty and pushing them into the poorest local authority areas in Britain. And actually there was another report that came out last year that had lots of problems in it by Ted Cantle, but it also showed that actually the areas that are becoming less integrated is actually down to white people moving out into the suburbs and leaving people who can't afford to move into the suburbs, black people, Asian people, Muslims, actually concentrated in the poorer areas in the city centres. But these three arguments around terrorism, integration and demographics are all combined through Islamophobia to form this idea of a dangerous enemy within